Welcome. This is blowing my mind. Thanks so much for coming. You are all most welcome. This is a good problem to have, that there are not enough chairs. There's some in the front here. If you want to come to the front, please join us. And make yourselves at home. My name's Alberto Puddu. I've got to tell you off the bat, I'm a member of Christ Church Cascades, and we're hosting this event, and it's great to have you all here. All right. It's a great turnout, obviously. I trust that your expectation will be met and even exceeded by tonight's events and the questions and everything that will flow from it. I've been wanting to organize a debate between a skeptic and a Christian for a while, but it's quite tricky, as you can imagine. You need to get good speakers on both sides, lest the one overpowers the other, and it becomes a one-sided affair, and you don't want that. So if you know Reitze, he's an obvious choice on the Christian side. He's involved with such things in apologetics, and he excels in anything he sets his mind to. He's a friend and a colleague, and then he moved on to the dark side, to private medicine, and I've missed him and the conversations we've had in theatre since then. I met Charles looking for a suitable and worthy counterpart to what I initially envisaged, a debate between the Christian and the skeptic about the existence of God. But after having coffee with Charles and a wonderful open discussion, we realized that we don't need to, as such, draw battle lines, but we could rather have a respectful and fruitful discussion. The aim of tonight, therefore, is to get to know and understand each other's point of view, and to maybe get a bit closer to the truth. Now, it'll be quite obvious both can't be true, So, for that matter, simply, both can't be true. And having said that, I strongly doubt we will all, after tonight, become either atheists or Christians following a thoroughly convincing argument by one of the speakers. But I trust we will listen and that we will be respectful and understanding. So without preempting the talks, both these men grew up in Christian households, attended church, had a crisis of faith, researched and searched, and then came to opposite conclusions. But we'll hear more about that from each of them later. I'm not going to keep you long, just some house rules. Please respect the school and the property. I don't know if you feel a bit nervous about coming back into a school like we do, but please respect the school, especially the bathrooms. The male or the boys' bathrooms with its crib is on the right here, and the ladies' bathroom just across the parking lot there. Please remember to put your cell phones off. The evening is recorded. Thanks very much, Charles, for organizing that. And it will hopefully be on YouTube afterwards. And then lastly, please, and I cannot stress this enough, please no heckling or shouting. This has come from both speakers as well, or anything to disrupt the conversation. We're trying to be civil here, we're trying to be understanding, and have a good understanding of each other. And this brings me to the format of the evening. There's going to be 15 minutes of testimony from each of the speakers. Charles, you first, huh? Charles first, how he came to where he is now, and then Reitze is going to give his testimony, 15 minutes, of how he got to where he is now. And then we're going to have 15 to 20 minutes, we'll see how it goes, of the one asking the other questions. So, I've got biographies from each of the speakers. I'm going to read them, lest I make a mistake, and then we'll get going. Thanks very much. So, Charles, until the age of 40, Charles Webster was a committed evangelical Christian. Raised and confirmed in the church, Charles had led cell groups, worship teams, youth groups, and preached from time to time. After a 5-year period of profound soul-searching, trying his utmost to justify his own faith in objective terms, Charles walked away from it, despite massive family and social fallout. Why? Married with 3 children, Charles is a former news journalist who works as a corporate communication contractor for American multinational. His passions are philosophy and music. An active member of the KZN Midlands musical community, Charles helped found Myth.co.za, which, by the way, is Music in the Hills. Aside from his undergraduate studies in communication and English, Charles went back to university in his middle age to complete honors and master's degrees in philosophy, specializing in the balance between the freedoms of speech and religion, among other topics. So that's Charles. Reitze. Raised as a Christian, Reitze Rodseth started to have serious doubts about the truth of religion. His time training as a medical specialist raised many questions that seemed to undermine the very foundations of Christianity. While studying in Canada, Reitze had the privilege of working with an exceptionally talented group of researchers, many of whom were atheists, who challenged them to face his doubts about his professed religion. Reitze then spent 6 months studying the truth claims of Christianity, as well as atheism and Islam, and comparing these with the reality we live in. He focused much of his attention on the issues of evolution, the authenticity of the Bible and the Koran, and the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. At the end of this process, he concluded that the Christian truth claims could be objectively verified, and that Christianity proves the most reasonable, coherent, robust, and powerfully explanatory worldview for the world we live in. He became a follower of Jesus. Reitze serves as a chapter director in Ratio Christi, a campus apologetics ministry at UKZN Pietermaritzburg. Aside from his medical qualifications, he is currently busy with his master's in Christian Apologetics and Philosophy from South Evangelical Seminary, North Carolina, USA. He is married to Miranda. They have 2 kids and 2 Great Danes. They've decided amongst each other who's going to start, and we look forward to Charles's testimony. Thanks very much, Charles.
There can be no peace until they renounce their duck god and accept our rabbit god. Are you seeing the picture here, ladies and gentlemen? Thanks for coming out, by the way. It's amazing to see all of you here on a cold Thursday evening. What is it about tribalism that captures us so strongly? Why is it that when 95% of our lives consist of things that we have in common, we define the relationships between us by the 5% that we don't? We all pay the same taxes. We all eat the same McDonald's. We want to live and raise our kids, one day die without too much pain, and hopefully have some fun along the way. So why are we here? This is not primarily a debate. It's billed as testimonies, and that's for a reason. When I look at Reitze, what do I see? I see a man who's dedicated his life to saving other lives. When you're at death's door, you're under sedation, there's a crisis happening, your organs are failing. Reitze is one of the guys you want there. When I look out at you and I see a mixture of people, and I see many Christians, I see human beings. I don't think Christians are stupid. I was a Christian for 40 years. I'd be calling myself stupid if I accused Christians of being stupid. I didn't suddenly become intelligent or more intelligent when I changed my views. What we are here to do is to access one another's humanity. We have to coexist in this world in a way that works for everyone. We have to live together. What's the best cure for racism? What's the best cure for homophobia? What's the best cure for religious discrimination? Well, it's to meet somebody from another race, from another sexual orientation, from another religion or no religion. Get to know the human being. And you realize that that's exactly what we are, human beings together. Atheism is a very bad predictor of whether I will like you or not. There are many atheists who I dislike intensely, and there are many Christians who I like intensely. And the more I get to know Reitze, the more that applies, I will say. I once crashed my car and was referred by a Christian friend, a Christian family member in fact, to a Christian panel beater. And as I walked in the door, the panel beater said to me, "Oh, that's fantastic. You're not one of those guys who wear doilies on their heads." And I thought, wow. Because even as a Christian, it was more important to me that you're a nice person than whether you agree with my belief system. So why am I here specifically tonight? I'm here because I have to live as an atheist in a world that is dominated by believers. Globally and nationally. In South Africa, our population is about 80% Christian. Many of them are very hostile even to my very existence. There are 13 countries in the world where I'd be executed for being an atheist. I've had to deal with loss of family, loss of friends. Being an atheist can have professional consequences. I know of many people. I'll mention two in particular, and I won't name them because they don't want to be named specifically. But I know of a musician, I know of a financial services expert who can't be open about their lack of belief because it would affect their livelihoods. In terms of my own experiences, I lost pretty much all of my friends when I left the church, the vast majority of them. The friend I met on my first day at university, we were friends for 20 years. When I came out to her as an atheist, said to me, among other things, "I only ever loved the Jesus in you." And my internal response was, well, what about the me in me? If you still doubt what it's like to be an atheist in a world dominated by believers, here's my challenge to you. Putting yourself genuinely in the shoes of the other person is a way to instill objectivity in your own view. So I can tell you that I'd be quite happy to walk around for weeks and months and years in a t-shirt with a fish that says, "I love Jesus." But I wonder how many Christians would be comfortable walking around in a shirt with an atheist label on it, even for a week, and understanding and experiencing the responses that you get. So this is a picture of me and some of my former friends and family members. I'm an atheist. So what is it to be an atheist? Well, it's really just the answer to one question. Fundamentally, all you need to be an atheist is not to accept the claim that there is at least one God or more gods. We're a growing group. We are not a religion. We're as moral and as immoral as any other group of people. We don't hate gods. It doesn't make sense to hate things that you don't think exist. We're not Satanists. We don't believe in Satan either. We're just normal people. Sorry, kids. So that's me. My son Michael, who unfortunately is at a history quiz this evening. My daughter Rachel, my eldest on the left, and our middle child Rebecca in the middle, and my wife Taryn on the right, in the front. And we're living our lives, and we're raising our kids, and we have hopes and dreams, and we hope to live peacefully and die one day without too much pain and have some fun along the way. This is a moment with my son Michael in the kitchen. Michael, my son, whom I love. I would never want anything to happen to Michael. He's a fantastic drummer. He does cross country. He's one of the most empathetic people you'll meet. When there are new kids at school, the teachers send them to Michael. If Taryn and I are going somewhere in two cars, Michael says to me, "Dad, will you be hurt if I go with Mom?" He's that kind of person. I love my son. Now I'd like to tell you the story of another son. Michael's dad, in fact. When I was about 10, I went to my own dad and I said to him, "Dad, what would you do if God asked you to sacrifice me?" And my dad said, "God would never ask me to do that." And I said to him, "Even at 10, I could do the logic. But Dad, it's right there in the Bible. God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac." And my dad said to me, "But it was only a test, son." And I said to him, "But Dad, God knows everything. He sees the future. He's there already. You've taught me this. How does someone who knows what's going to happen in the future have to test somebody like that?" Even 10-year-old Charles was figuring it out. I was taught to venerate Abraham. This is a testimony. This is my experience. I was terrified. I lost sleep. How is it moral for God, who apparently loves me, to ask my father to sacrifice me if I'm Isaac? Even if it's a test, even if he didn't go through with it, that is what Abraham and Isaac believed was going to happen. It wasn't just this story that struck me as disturbing. But that's the serious part over. This is the tree of faith, if you will. The power of religion is strong. You start growing up, you're raised, everybody around you is telling you that your faith is right and good, that there's a God in heaven who loves you and that you have to get to heaven, and that to do that you have to love Jesus. You're taught that personal experiences are proof. Contradictions with science and logic are addressed, explained away through apologetics. And so began my journey as a leader in the church. And my journey was sincere. It was 40 years. And I led people in what I thought was right. I regret that now. At the age of 35, though, I started asking questions again. I think the reason was that I grew tired of having to edit my answers to questions to make sure that they didn't contradict my theology. Hence the tree. So if you look at the tree, if you could imagine that the small twigs and leaves on the outside are the small elements of doctrine, baptism, transubstantiation, and as you move towards the middle, it's bigger things like the Trinity, or maybe which version of Christianity you belong to. Are you a full immersion Baptist, or do you just sprinkle a little bit? The big branches, which religion do you belong to? And then the main trunk of the tree, which is where God, him, her, or itself sits. Everything is dependent on the main trunk of the tree. If there's no God, none of the rest is relevant. And of course the root system, where you've got the evidence and reason that everything that we say we know should be based. So what did I do? I took what's called the free thinker's route. I don't want to get involved in high philosophy here, but essentially what it is to be a free thinker is to discard all the things that you're taught, all the indoctrination you've gone through, all the presuppositions and assumptions that you have, and to start from scratch and to say, I'm only going to believe that which I can support. I'm only going to follow and hold as truth the things that I can really sign my name to. Because I've lived my life based on standards that were given to me by other people. And the contradictions, the dissonance, the internal conflict between the harm that I see from those beliefs and the morality that I personally feel wasn't something that I could deal with anymore. I found the most learned atheists that I could to discuss and debate with. I'm not interested in belief anymore. I'm interested in knowledge. I want to know. And we can't know everything. I hate not knowing things. Everybody wants the comfort of knowing. There are big questions. Does life have a purpose? What happens after we die? Is there a God? I don't like not knowing the answers to questions. But you know what? I like postulating things just for the sake of filling a hole and getting it wrong, even less than I like not knowing things. So my non-belief is really not a choice. Being persuaded, being convinced of something isn't something that you simply do in a vacuum. I examined each of my beliefs thoughtfully, belief by belief. And as I found them insufficiently supported, I discarded them one by one. And so I got to the worst place in the world. The place where for the last 2 or 3 years that I was in the church, I found it impossible to stay and also impossible to leave. Because there was pain everywhere. I couldn't stay. I was leading worship. I was praying, and I hadn't read a Bible or prayed in private for 2 or 3 years. At the same time, I'm on a steam locomotive that's been going for the last 35 to 40 years. People expect me to do the things that I'm doing. They expect me to lead the things that I'm leading, be the person they expect and hope me to be. The social disappointment, the familial rejection, these are things that weigh heavy. But I can't believe what I don't believe. It would mean pretending. There's no integrity in that. And for a while it's justifiable. We all do that. These things don't happen in a single step. When we change, our minds change, and slowly our reality changes to suit it, and eventually something gives, and we make the shift, we step out. But a major part of my healing was one day when my wife said to me, "Charles, I like you more as an atheist than I ever did as a Christian." And it was possibly the biggest gift I've received in my life. I also found new people, of course. And as I've already pointed out, I've got some of them here tonight. Some of them have traveled far. Thank you, guys. You know who you are. I was asked by a good friend, a new friend recently, why I thought that God needed to prove himself to me. Let's ask ourselves, how important is religion in our lives? It determines, or at the very least informs, affects everything. How we spend our money, who we love, how we spend our time, who we can have sex with and how. The food we eat sometimes, our morality, the laws that we draft in Parliament. But more than that, religion claims to give us the answer to absolutely the most important questions of life. God, purpose, afterlife, right and wrong. And so I sat and asked myself, if I'm expecting in all the other spheres of my life, if I'm buying food, I expect to buy it before the sell-by date. I expect the food to be safe. I expect the nutritional content on the packaging to be accurate. If I'm buying medicine, I expect it to have been tested. I want to know that the active ingredient is going to do what it says it does. There's not just a placebo being sold to me. If I'm hiring somebody, I want to see their CV. And so I could no longer ignore the fact that for me, this claimed answer to the most important questions of existence of humanity was being subjected to lower standards of proof and evidence than all these other things in my whole life that are of lesser importance, actually, in existential terms. So what do I like the most about being an atheist? What I like the most is the freedom. Not just the freedom as some prejudiced folks would imagine, to just go out and do whatever I like. But the freedom to answer any question with the thoughts that I really have, based on the best evidence and the best reason that I can summon, and not to feel constrained to edit my response based on my theology. I don't accept claims that I feel are unsupported. I have the freedom to change my position if I find better evidence, or if I find that my existing evidence is wrong. I don't believe things because they make me feel better. I don't believe things because everyone around me tells me that they're right, or that many, many, many people around the world also believe them. I don't believe things because there's a gap in human knowledge or scientific discovery that I feel needs to be filled just in order to satisfy my yearning for an answer, because I do understand that we want answers. I don't believe things because there's something that's complex or difficult or requires hard work to understand, and so therefore it must be God. Most importantly, I believe in being true to oneself. And I believe that everyone should be true to themselves and should strive to be decent human beings. And I believe that everyone should have that freedom. Thank you very much.
So I want to talk a little bit about this belief in God thing and share some of my experience. I grew up in the church. I went to Sunday school. Because I was the nerd, I won all the prizes in the Sunday school. I could quote the Bible to you backwards. I had it all sorted out. Went to university. was also in the steam locomotive of Christianity. You've got to act like this, you've got to be like this. I married a Christian girl, and thankfully she's amazing. And like at some stage I'm going like, what do I actually believe this stuff? I'm studying biology, I'm going through my life, I'm getting all these questions, all the other religions, questions that Charles has raised. And over time I got to a point where I didn't really believe this Christianity anymore. But I'm living a life of hypocrisy because I'm leading Bible studies and I'm also doing the whole katoot. But internally, I didn't believe it anymore. And you sort of just gone along this pathway for so long that you just have to keep going, do a good show. So at one stage, my wife and I went over to Canada. I was doing a post-doc research on that side, and I was sitting with my research supervisor, a brilliant guy, really, really smart, one of the top researchers in the world. And he was an atheist. And, we started talking about Christianity and stuff, and I felt like pony up, got to make the defense, you're the Christian, so I talked a bit. He said to me, Reitze, you're a great guy, really enjoying having you here, doing all this work. But dude, you got a problem. Why would you believe in this myth? Like, seriously, you've got a delusion. Why would you believe in this God in the sky type of thing? There's no evidence, there's no basis for it. And I was doing a research fellowship, so I had a lot of time, to sit around and do nothing. And I decided, man, he's got a point. Because I'm living a life that lacks integrity. And as Al said, this stuff's either true or it's not. There's a God or there's not. You can't have half the God, I think. So I said, well, I'm going to put it on the line. I'm going to try and study this from a scientific viewpoint. My whole background is research, admitting that I have biases and I have certain inclinations in certain ways. I'm going to try and put it out there, and I'm going to see what fits reality the best. And if Christianity is not true, it's going to be a disaster, and I can only imagine what you went through. But I'm going to junk it, because I can't continue to live what is in effect a lie. I can't continue with the schizophrenic point. A caveat is that I probably didn't want Christianity to be true. In the way that I was living my life and where I was, I've sort of felt, well, it would be easier if it wasn't true. And I'm just going to run through a few points that I came to. So it was a serious process for me, and I think a lot like what you've, in the searching for what is true. And for me is, could I objectively show this to be true? Now, I couldn't show this to be mathematical proof. Like, can you show that your wife loves you, like mathematically? Certain things we can't know to that degree of precision. When you're doing physics, you can do tests and show, well, that's the physics. Start to move into biology and medicine, and I do a lot of research, and things get a little bit less clear. You start to move into some other aspects of life, like, does your partner love you? Well, where's the mathematical formula for that? You can see it, you can have a proof for it, but you can't have a mathematical proof for it. So my argument, and the reason that I became a Christian, is that I believe that belief in God is reasonable and rational. And for the nerds down there at the bottom, please notice the joke. So what is the biggest thing, and this is probably for me the biggest thing, is that when we look at cosmology, when I look at the world around me, it suggests that the world had a beginning. There was a point at which the universe had a beginning. This is a fairly smart Russian gentleman, Mr. Valenkin. He's a physicist up in the Stephen Hawking range. And he says, at this point, it seems that the answer to this question, whether the universe had a beginning, well, the answer is probably yes. And that's what he says to Stephen Hawking. He wrote a paper for him for his birthday. What a bunch of nerds. So whatever begins to exist has got a cause. Things don't pop out of nowhere. You don't have little rabbits popping into existence on my right-hand side there. And if they do, you'd say, wow, who did that? Somebody caused it. The universe began to exist. Time, space, matter had a beginning. And so the universe had a cause. And if the universe is time, matter, space, energy, everything that we have around us, then the thing that caused the universe must be non-physical. It must be outside time and outside of space. It must be powerful. And I would argue that it is an agent, it is a person. If you don't have, when I lift this remote up and down, it's moving up and down because my muscles are contracting, signals running to the arm, agonists, antagonists, But the other reason is, why is it moving? It's because I chose to make it move. That's agent causality. If you don't have any matter, if you don't have any muscles, how do you make something happen? Well, agent causality. Now, when I ask most people in the world, what is the thing that we call non-physical, outside time, outside space, all-powerful, personal, we call that God. That's the sort of universal, not universal, but that's the standard definition of who God is. That's what I speak about when I speak about God. This is what I meant when I said in my blurb about the statements about God corresponding with reality. Cosmology is one of the hardest physical sciences that we have. Or maybe not one of the physical, but it's a hard physical science. And it suggests there is a beginning to the universe. And Christianity, Islam, and Judaism say that God is separate from the universe and that He created it. Well, atheism has to say something existed eternally, and they'll say the universe generally existed eternally. So all of a sudden, this started to fit into the picture of Christianity. Going on to the physics, our universe looks designed. It's crazily designed. If you look at the components of our world, the way in which it accelerates, when you look at the strong electrical forces and the weak electrical forces and the cosmological constants and all these things that people throw out there, it looks like somebody made it happen. And don't take my word for it. Here's the physicist. This guy says the impression of design is overwhelming when you look at it. When you look at the physics of this world, the way that the world is put together. Who's that? Roger Penrose says, I would say the universe has a purpose. It's not just there somehow by chance. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that some super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology. These guys aren't all Christians. These are people looking at the evidence going like, whoa, this is so improbable that, it's impossible. When you win the lottery 3 times in a row, nobody's going, whoa, that's a lucky chance. Somebody's going like, yeah, do you know the Guptas? And then for me, and a lot of my work was trying to understand this concept of the design in biology. Now, I used to work with Al, and he's a spinal surgeon. So you strip open this person's back, and you just see all of this bone and matter stuck together, and he's putting stuff into it, and it's amazing. The design components of our biological systems are overwhelming. And when you start to look at it, you see that certain features of the biology that we see around us look as though they've been designed, as though something has created and has put it together in that structure. This is an article, nerd, from the Algorithmic Origins of Life. I can't see the date, 2013. There's general agreement that the informational aspect of life is perhaps its key property. The most important thing, the thing that makes us living, these guys are arguing, is actually information in the cells. And we see that information encoded in our DNA. When you start to see the information in DNA, it looks like somebody designed a blueprint. And the only place that we get design from is from intelligence. Don't take my word for it. Take Richard Dawkins, who's, if you don't know, is I don't call him the poster boy, but he's a very vocal atheist. He says the machine code of genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchangeable with those of a computer engineering journal. When you put your presuppositions aside and you look at the data, the atheist says this looks like it's computer code that's written by a person. And when you start to look at the DNA design, it puts human coding to shame. When I say thank you for coming out tonight, you don't think that came out by chance. I mean, that conveys a message, it's structured, it's got a context to it, you understand what I'm trying to say. We're supposed to believe that by pure chance, billions of monkeys went hammering away and they created the DNA that we've got. They created, if you get these guys hammering away long enough, you'll get one of Shakespeare's sonnets. They actually did this experiment. They took some monkeys, put a computer thing in the cage, I think about 5 or 6 monkeys, He left them there for a few weeks and saw what happens. The monkeys jumped up and down on it. One of the two used it as a toilet, hammered away on the thing. At the end of it, they actually found that the monkeys hadn't generated any words. Because to have a word, you need a space and a word and a space. So they reckon that if every single particle in the world, in the entire universe, was a supercomputer, and the supercomputer tried to punch out randomly a sonnet of Shakespeare, there are not enough seconds in the existence of the universe to have created one single protein. But here we are. So when I look at that design, I look at it and I go, whoa, this looks like a put-up job. Like somebody's been messing around with the physics here and the biology. I believe that it's always, at all times, in all places, wrong to torture an innocent child for pleasure. Would you agree with me? If you don't, please come and see me afterwards. And I believe that that statement is objectively true. It just is true. No matter who's in charge, no matter what's going on, that's an objectively true statement. So how do we explain that you know that that's an objectively true statement? What is the basis for this morality? How do we ground it? If you believe that we are evolved beings, then this evolved morality is arbitrary. It doesn't have a grounding. If we had evolved in a different way, we would have a different morality. If we descended off from bees, then it would have been okay to have drones running around with a queen. If we were coming off from arachnids, then it would have been okay for the women to eat the men after sex. But you laugh, but that's the implications of it. Michael Roos, who's an evolutionary biologist, who's an atheist, really great guy, I often suggest that to atheists that he's a good person to read because he's a clear thinker, a very careful thinker. He says, by morality, whether it's wrong to torture a child for fun, is a biological adaptation, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims and objective somethings. Ethics is an illusion. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Whether it is wrong to torture a child for fun is an illusion. He's saying, at its core, there is no grounding on it. He's not saying that you should do it, and I want to just pull that differentiation. He's going to say that there's a moral imperative on us to do it, but the grounding for this is totally arbitrary. In fact, whether you torture this is like your church for ice cream. It's arbitrary. It just is. In theism, we ground this objective morality, the sense that you know that it is wrong, we ground that in God. And there's a weight on those things. When you see somebody suffering, there's a weight, a moral demand on you. You must go and do something. It is wrong not to do something. There's an expectation that you do it. And where does that demand come from? There's a moral law. There's a weight to it. And the moral law comes from a moral lawgiver. That sounds like God to me. And then finally, we've gone down from all of these gods to why am I a Christian? And Christianity's key claim is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I'm an anesthetist, ICU specialist. I see a lot of dead people. When they're dead, they stay dead. If we're lucky, we get there in 30 minutes. Maybe we can pull them back. In extreme cases, maybe an hour if they're really cold. But dead people stay dead. As a Christian, I'm supposed to go out as a research fellow with a PhD and tell them that I believe that 2,000 years ago, a man rose from the dead who claimed to be God incarnate and that he died for our sins. And I must go off to the PHRI in Canada, talk to my PhD supervisors and tell them I believe the story. And that was, for me, was too far. And that's why I studied this resurrection, because if it couldn't make an argument for this, then I wasn't going to believe it. So there are three core facts. Jesus Christ was crucified and he died. He lived, he was crucified and he died. And the Bible, you don't even need to look at the Bible. This fine fellow with a beautiful beard is Josephus. He's a Jewish historian. He writes about Jesus living and Jesus dying and being crucified. Tacitus is a Roman historian. He does it the same thing. Lucian of Samosata is actually a satirist, and he mocks the Christians. He says, well, if you want to have a good time in a city, you go and find the Christians, you tell them that you're a Christian, they'll take you in, you can go and eat their food, have a jewel there. And they believe this stupid thing about this guy that lived on the cross and then died. So Jesus Christ lived and died. And then something happened to the body. these guys started saying that the tomb was empty. Now, when somebody tells me that the tomb is empty, or my father-in-law, my father has risen from the dead, what I normally do is just show them the body, and that stops the whole conversation. But these guys saying that the tomb is empty, that there's nobody there. In fact, the Jews themselves who killed Jesus said, "We don't have the body." They said, "It's the dog ate my homework" argument. When you say the dog ate your homework, you know that you don't have your homework. And these Jews were saying, you, the disciples, stole Jesus' body, thereby saying, well, we don't have the body. And then these guys started saying that they saw Jesus come to life. So these 12 disciples of him start saying Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And when you tell a lie, there's normally a need for an advantage. You either have money, power, or sex, the three great motivators. So these guys start saying that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Everybody thinks they're crazy. They get kicked out of the synagogue. They start getting attacked. Most of them get killed or martyred. They don't pull any girls. They don't make any money. Why would they say that? So you tell me, well, no, Jesus brainwashed them. They really, really believe that he rose from the dead. There's this guy called Saul, who later became Paul, who hated the Christians, went out persecuting, destroying them. He was a Jew, and he believed that these Christians were there to destroy his Jewish faith. All of a sudden, he says that he met the risen Lord Jesus Christ. He does a 180 degrees. He throws away his entire career. He ends up sacrificing all his power, all his prestige, because of this ridiculous notion. He ends up being beheaded on a Roman road somewhere because of this statement that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And then James, the brother of Jesus, starts saying that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he rose from the dead. And you're going like, the day I start doing that, you go to my brother, and he'll tell you that I'm not the Son of God. When your family knows you. And before this, James was actually telling Jesus, like, you're crazy. You've got a demon in you, saying wrong. Why are you acting like this? All of a sudden, 3 days after this, James starts saying, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. When you start looking at all of this and you start putting it together, the question for me is what explains this? What explains the death, the empty tomb, and then these statements? And this, for me, was the major point on why I became a Christian. Jesus Christ makes these statements about himself, which are ridiculous. I come from the Father. I've seen the Father. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I can forgive your sins. He tells us what God is like as the loving Father that calls us to him. And then he goes and dies. But God raises him 3 days after his death as a proof of what happened. And it's not just a statement. This is historical fact. Now, your interpretation of this might differ in what it means. When you start to put all of this stuff together, and I love minions, just by the way. When you start to put all this stuff together like I did, I came to a conclusion based on a cumulative body of evidence. Man is incurably religious. As Charles has said, majority of people running around believe that there is a God, that there is a supernatural something. And I'm not saying because a lot of people believe it, it's right. I'm saying that there's something innate in humans, in the way that the world is designed, or we are designed, that makes us aware of the fact that there is something more there. And philosophers have argued that this can be a probably basic truth, like you know that you're here at the moment, so you can know that there is a God. And I look at the cosmological argument, and I look at the design in physics, and I look at the design in biology, and I look at this argument of morality, and I look at the resurrection of Jesus, and I look at my own lived experience of how Christianity says, I am noble because I'm created in the image of God, and so I can do amazing things, but I'm also fallen, and so I do the most petty, humiliating, stupid things just off the spur of the moment. How I'm able to conceive and dream of all these big things, but I'm never ever able to reach it. When I look at the lived experience of Christianity, I come to the conclusion that there is a God, and particularly that this God is reflected in Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Oh, serious stuff, isn't it? And it makes you wonder all. Thanks very much to both speakers. What we're going to do now, we're going to pass around some pamphlets. Sorry, I did it myself, so they're not perfectly centered, and they're not perfectly cut. We're going to pass them around. On the one hand, you'll see there's a question side. Just tick Reitze or Charles and ask the question you'd like to ask. We're going to gather them and we'll ask them the questions. In the meantime, while we're doing this, they're thinking about questions for each other. You'll see on the other side of the paper, there's something else that you can or you can't. You can leave it or not. Don't worry about that, and I'll speak about that later. Right, happy? You guys ready? So this is off the cuff, obviously. They didn't prepare anything for the next part. So don't expect such a perfect presentation. And I'll let them to it. I don't know who wants to start.
So actually, in the interests of transparency, we actually decided to share with the questions that we're going to ask with one another. So one of the aims that both Charles and I wanted is to have the best pitch that atheism would make and best pitch that Christianity can make. I don't think it's fair to stack up against a straw man. So I've pulled together 3 questions and Charles has pulled together 3 questions, and we've shared them with one another so that we can give a good go and answer it carefully and thoughtfully. And I've been talking for a long time, so can I ask the first question?
Go for it.
Yeah, I can't remember them. So the first question that I had for Charles is, what would make you change your mind? What would move you from saying there is no God to there is a God? What would that look like? What would that evidence look like?
So I'm going to start answering that by saying that the worst insult that anyone could pay me is to say that I'm arguing in bad faith, because I've changed my position on probably a dozen of the major life questions, and at great cost. And so it really is close to my heart. And so the short answer is that I regard myself as a true skeptic. And as a true skeptic, I am determined, in fact, to follow the best reason and evidence. In the case of believing in a God, and you've narrowed it to Christianity in particular, it becomes about following sufficient reason and evidence. And to figure out what would be sufficient, and for the purposes of brevity here, because we don't have all night, I've considered the question in 2 ways. We look at the extent of the claim, how big it is, how serious it is, how difficult it is. And then we look at the content of the claim. What is the claim actually saying? Can we support the facts based on the evidence and reason? And we all do this every day. So Carl Sagan said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if I tell you folks that you, sir, in the front row, I tell you that I had eggs and bacon for breakfast this morning, would you believe me? Probably, because people have breakfast, there are eggs and there is bacon, and I'm not making an outlandish claim. But if I asked you, sir, to lend me R1 million and I promised you that I would pay you back next week, I would suggest that you're going to need a little bit more in the way of substantiation and proof. So David Hume, a famous philosopher, said a wise man apportions his belief to the evidence that's available. And so I think claims that are supported only by weak or circumstantial evidence. And there are a lot of claims. So Reitze has presented a whole heap of claims here this evening in his presentation, and we don't have time to go through all of them clearly. And I get the feeling that there may be many conversations that Reitze and I have on these topics, because Each one of those could fill an evening. But the short answer is, I find those claims weak. I don't find them to be supported by the evidence. Claims that are especially serious in nature and that are especially important. And that's the case when we're talking about the God claim, that claims to tell us that we're sinners, that we might go to hell, or we get to go to heaven if we do believe. These really require an extra measure of evidence, like the $1 million, right? So that's the extent of the claim. That was the first aspect that I looked at. The second aspect is the content of the claim. What is the claim actually saying? Can I support what the claim is saying? When claiming that there is a God, there is a whole series of claims, and in particular, if you're talking about the Christian God, there's a whole series of claims. In philosophy, we call these contingencies. The plain English is dependencies. The Christian God's existence depends on a whole bunch of other claims. Firstly, the claim that there is some God somewhere, that a God exists. Secondly, that the God is personal, not just some creative force. That this God has an opinion about what's right and wrong in the world. Okay? That this God has communicated this opinion to us. That we've been able to hear that communication clearly and accurately. And then, possibly the biggest leap of all, and at this point, without going into all of the arguments that Reitze presented, but in particular things like the cosmological claim, the claim from design, even claims from morality. How do you make the leap? If I were to grant every single one of those claims, for the sake of discussion, if I admitted that there was design in nature, if I admitted that the universe had a beginning and some cause, if I admitted that somehow a God was necessary for morality, you still have this massive chasm to cross to get from some sort of God somewhere in the universe to Yahweh, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and the Trinity, and taking communion, and crosses, and deaths, and resurrections. Each of these claims, all these claims that the Christian God depends on, the existence of a God, that the God cares, that it's personal, that it communicates with us, that we have heard the communication accurately. Each of them has to be separately, independently demonstrated. These are not claims that we can just lightly accept. You're talking about, apparently, your eternal future. So what would the evidence actually look like? Which I think is possibly the nub of where Reitze wanted to go with this. And my honest answer, and I don't mean to frustrate anyone with this, but I simply don't know, because I don't know of any gods that have been demonstrated, so I don't know what it takes to demonstrate a God. But the good news, if you'll forgive the turn of phrase, is that Yahweh knows. And Yahweh apparently loves me, is omnipresent, interacts with reality, wants a relationship with me because he thinks I'm important enough to number the hairs on my head, which, as I pointed out to Reitze, is not much of an achievement in either of our cases. So I'm sure he'll pop in and say hi. Except he hasn't. Where is this God? Why hasn't he simply made himself plain? Why do we have to resort to difficult scientific arguments, apologetics, arguments from design? I wanted my faith to be true. But these arguments don't work. And despite my bias in favor of faith, the price I had to pay, I should tell you, that I desperately wanted my faith to be true at the time. I'm going to answer a question that might be in some of the minds out there preemptively, and that's the question of free will. And people will say, and have said to me in the past, that God wants me to love Him truly and profoundly and deeply, because that's what faith indicates. And so making Himself a little hard to find, playing a little hard to get, increases my faith. And 10-year-old Charles comes back and says, but the devil was in heaven. And he knew God was there, and he still had the free will and the independence of mind to leave. And if the worship of God in heaven one day, and for those of you who believe in it, I sincerely hope you go there. If that worship in heaven is to be sincere, presumably it requires free will. Because if it's forced, if there's no free will involved, then the worship is meaningless. And this seems to be the whole basis on which the Garden of Eden and choice was built. So clearly it's possible for there to be a world in which God is able to enjoy sincere worship all the time, and everybody chooses to do so voluntarily, even though they have free will. Why wasn't that world simply created here and now? So, I don't know if that answers the question, Reitze, but sufficient evidence is the short answer.
And so I understand from what you're saying is that you can't quantify that at the moment. Like, you don't really know what it would take to generate that. Like, if I could show you mathematical proof, then you'd say yes. Like, if I could prove it mathematically. So
the mathematical proof thing is a little bit of a red herring for me. You raised it in the concept in the concept of loving your wife, and I think we need to distinguish between mathematical proofs and other forms of proofs or other forms of evidence. So the fact, for example, that you can have faith, or you can know that your wife loves you, doesn't mean that all forms of faith are equal. And the fact that it's not a mathematical proof that you look at when you're understanding that your wife loves you doesn't mean that proof is any less rational or empirical in that sense. It's not a measured proof, but and in the broader context here, I'm not aiming at absolutes. So the idea that I absolutely have to know something, I'm not even sure that those absolute truths exist. I'm aiming here at useful truths, and I can usefully and reasonably and rationally know that my wife loves me. That doesn't have to be mathematical. For it to be absolutely true, and for it to be knowledge in the meaningful and useful sense of the way that we use words like truth and knowledge.
I think if anybody's married to us, they must really love us. So I'm going to ask my second question, because I think it builds onto what we were talking about, if you're happy with that. So in medicine, you'll often see a constellation of symptoms. And you'll say, okay, you put this and this and this, and you're coughing, and you've got a snotty nose, and you're feeling bad, you've got a high temperature, and it's this time of year, and so you've got swine flu. And part of my argument here is that, and you've said that you've got to search for God. I would argue that, well, when you walk outside and you look at the tree, people know, majority of people in the world go, well, there's something else there, So it's not maybe that difficult, but when I look at that, plus you look out at the stars and the design of the stars, you don't need to be a physicist to go, wow, that God moment when you look at it. When I look at the human's body's functioning, and when I put all of these together, for me, that cumulative case, like there's a dead body lying there, and there's the smoking gun lying there, and there's powder in your hands, and you're going to inherit. You start putting all those things together, and you go, well, it's not irrational to say it's possible that there's a God, and it's not unreasonable to say that. How do you deal with that argument?
So the first and important response is, again, what I said earlier in terms of making the leap from that God to a Christian God. But I'll put that aside for a second. We know that guns cause death. We can observe that. And if we're talking about answers and explanations, I think it's important to discern between the two. An answer is not necessarily an explanation. For an explanation to be valid and sound in philosophical terms, which we won't go into here, but it needs to actually demonstrate the causative effect. You need to be able to show that there is a God. You don't get to simply assert, hey, there's a tree, so there must be God. I agree that the tree is complex. I agree that humans are complex. I agree that the universe is complex. But at the same time, folks, complexity is not necessarily a proof of design at all. Many designs are simple, some are complex. So neither complexity nor simplicity will necessarily imply design. The other aspect to my answer, and we actually are going off script here somewhat, but it's fine, because I love this stuff, and we could talk all night, but we won't keep you all night, I promise. We don't get to just choose the good parts of design and say, hey, it must be that God planned this for us. If we look honestly at the entire universe, what this universe is mostly designed for, if that's the assumption, is nothingness and death. We have, I think it's the Andromeda galaxy, Clint, that's headed towards the Milky Way. At some point it's going to hit us. Who designed that? Who designed our eye with a blind spot if we're looking at the human body? There's a nerve. Help me out, Reitze. The nerve in the neck.
Recurrent laryngeal.
So, in a giraffe, this nerve runs from the brain all the way down to the around the heart area, I think, and back up into the brain. These are not. We don't get to just take the great, seemingly intelligent parts of design and assert that therefore it was designed for us. We look at the fact that even on our own planet, almost every species that has ever lived no longer exists. So when the next meteorite hits us like it hit the Yucatan Peninsula probably 65 million years ago and wipes out all life on Earth like it wiped out the dinosaurs, are we still going to say the Earth is designed for human life? And by the way, the dinosaurs themselves were around for 60, 65 million years. Homo sapiens has been around for maybe 200,000 at a really generous guess. So at this stage, we'd have to say the dinosaurs were more successful and the Earth was probably more designed for them. There are many arguments to this. Anyway, I don't want to talk all night.
Moderator, can I do a 2-second response on the laryngeal nerve? I mean, so the argument is that the laryngeal nerve seems to be like an absolute waste of space, because it runs down from the brain and then it throws this big loop around the aortic arch and then it comes back up to the larynx over here. And as Richard Dawkins says, well, if it was so well designed, why didn't it just run straight from the brain to that point? So the interesting thing is that when part of what the laryngeal nerve does is, and part of the complex that it supplies is it supplies the heartbeat, the sympathetic system. And when you're an embryo, it all needs to be together in one point because you're only like 2-3 millimeters. So you have to have a functional system from the beginning. And your vascular system needs to develop. So as the vascular system develops and the aortic arch rotates down, the laryngeal nerve moves with it. Dawkins then says, well, you should actually just innervate this thing from the top. And interestingly enough, there's a nerve called the superior laryngeal nerve that does innervate it from the top, and as the inferior part of the larynx. Interestingly enough, your larynx is innervated from 2 points so that you don't choke when you drink the water that we've been drinking. So as a biologist, as a doctor, I'm always interested in these arguments when they're put against how badly they're designed. And it's like when you see a gymnast do a triple backflip and you go like 9.8 and he says, yeah, you come do it, These things are incredibly designed. Okay, moving on to my final question. So, and I think we're going to get to this a little bit. For me, the kicker, I'm a South African from Dutch and Norwegian heritage, sitting in the middle of Africa, and I follow a Jewish sage that died 2,000 years ago. Why? For me, the kicker is this resurrection thing. And Christianity stands or falls on the resurrection. This claim that Jesus said, I am the Son of God, and I'm going to prove it to you by the resurrection. You've been in the church, you've been around with it, you must have come across these arguments. How do you respond to this?
Okay, so I'm going to ask for latitude here, because this is not a simple question, and it's your main claim, it seems to me. So, Mr. Moderator, I don't know what to do.
We'd love to hear your argument, honestly, but we are running short of time. And a previous debate we've had, a criticism was that we didn't give enough time for response from the audience, which is a fair comment. Okay, we've had our say now, or go home. So please give us your argument. We'd love to hear it, but we do want to consider audience, please.
I will try to give you the Reader's Digest. Okay, so I'm going to start just briefly by referring to the third-party authors that you referred to, and guys like Josephus. Josephus, firstly, there's a lot of talk that the text around Jesus was added in later to his text, but that aside, I don't think that those texts speak directly to the validity of the resurrection. So I'm going to set them aside in that sense. Very briefly then, when historians look at evidence, there's some key things that they look at. They want evidence that's contemporary, preferably eyewitnesses that were there at the time or write about it very close to the time. They look at multiple sources, many of them if they can. That's what they want. If the sources all come from one source, then you don't have 20 sources, you just have the one source, in fact. They want sources to be consistent to one another, to corroborate with one another, but not to collaborate with one another. And they want sources to be unbiased. Our main source for knowing about the resurrection of Jesus is the Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament. When were the Gospels written? They weren't contemporary. They were passed down by oral tradition. So Mark was written sometime around 65, 70 of the Common Era. Matthew 10 to 15 years later. John another 10 to 15 years later, around 90 to 95. So what we have is not contemporary historical evidence. We have books that were written between 60 and 90 years after the events that they claim to describe. In Corinthians, Paul refers to the resurrection briefly. That was about 20 years, written about 20 years after the resurrection happened. None of the authors were eyewitnesses. Paul specifically states that he wasn't. The Gospels themselves were only even named in the 2nd century. They were written anonymously. We don't actually know who wrote them. The namings in some part have been based on clues in the text, but we don't actually know who wrote them. The followers of Jesus were Aramaic speakers. They were mostly illiterate, lower class men. The Gospels were written by rhetorically trained Greeks. So what we have here is an oral tradition passed down for decades. If you've ever played the telephone game at a children's party, you know what happens. 4 or 5 people and the message is lost. We're talking about an oral tradition that was passed down for decades by people who overtly, specifically want to convert other people to their belief system. And the facts of the story change. How do we know that they change? Well, you just go and look at the Gospels themselves. So, what day did Jesus die? What time of day did Jesus die? Was it 9 a.m. or in the afternoon? Did he carry his cross all the way, or did Simon of Cyrene carry it? Did both the robbers mock Jesus, or did one mock Jesus? Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before or after Jesus died? It depends on which gospel you read. And that's just the death. In terms of the resurrection, who went to the tomb? Did Mary Magdalene go alone? Did she go with other women? If it was with other women, how many? And who were they? Was the stone rolled away before they got to the tomb or not? Who did they see in the tomb? Was it a man? Was it two men? Was it an angel? What were they told to tell the disciples? To stay in Jerusalem, to go to Galilee? Did the woman tell anybody, or were they silent? So that's just the generic story of the discrepancies. If we look at the actual copies that we have, the Gospels that we read today are not based on the original. They weren't translated from the original versions that were written 60 to 90 years after Jesus' death. The first piece of any gospel that we have is a thing called P52. It's a piece of mark that's about the size of a credit card. It's called P52 because it's written on papyrus, and it was the 52nd piece that was found. That was found, that dates back to about 125 AD or CE. So the first piece of any gospel that we have is the size of a credit card, and it's nearly 100 years after Jesus died. The first copies of the complete gospels that we have only come in at around 200 CE. So, we have an oral tradition that's passed from mouth to mouth to mouth to mouth to mouth and changes. Then we have people who write the Gospels 60 to 90 years after the events. Then we have books that are lost. Nobody has any of the original copies. Nobody even has a copy of 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 a copy until 125 AD or CE. And that piece is only this size. And the first full Gospels only appear at about 200 CE. So my conclusions are, they're not contemporary. We have 4 Gospels. A couple of them probably come from a third source that scholars postulate, a thing called Q. Rather than corroborating, it seems Matthew and Luke were in fact collaborating based on this earlier document. The sources are not biased. The intent of sharing these Gospels and rewriting them was to convert people. And they're not consistent. Why did they lie? Why did they lie? Because they were converting people. And we know from stories of alien sightings that large groups of people, and I don't believe in alien sightings, perhaps some of you do, but large groups of people are perfectly capable of sharing evidence, eyewitness testimony from today, this century, and absolutely fabricated. That's not 6 to 9 centuries of oral tradition followed by centuries of copying, where in some cases we don't even know what the books actually said originally. So that's my response to the resurrection.
So you're saying that the historical documents underpinning it and the argument that they're making is not valid? In essence.
In essence.
Keep within the time frame.
And I'm saying we don't have people claiming that they saw the resurrection or Christ resurrected. What we have is books that are historically very questionable, claiming to report people who claimed to have seen Jesus resurrected.
Okay, I understand. So in 2 seconds, just my rebuttal to that is that the top atheist or non-Christian scholars, Gerard Ludeman, Bart Ehrman, will say that the disciples believed what they saw. So they believed, they saw, and they think that there's historically enough evidence to know that these guys, Paul, James, and the disciples, believed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. And I think if you read their work, they'll say, you're taking about 60 years. We're talking about ancient history, 2,000 years ago. This is evidence of an incredibly high quality. This is not CNN. The amount of information that we have about Julius Caesar is about 300-400 years of time frame between that, and significantly less information. So I would say that you've painted a fairly bleak picture of it, but I'd say that some non-Christian scholars would say that information, that the standard of the evidence is actually much stronger than what we suggest, and maybe we can have a debate on this. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Next question. Okay, my turn to be questioned.
So weirdly, I sent you my questions, and I don't have them in front of me.
So I did the same thing.
See, I got him to admit it.
Yeah, I had to write them down. You talked about where we're born as a Reitze. A lot of people are born in different countries and they grow up.
Right. So if you were born, if any of us had been born in India, we'd probably be Hindus. If we were born in Pakistan, we'd be Muslim. Somehow, conveniently, we're all born into the right religion. And unless our exposure to religion is delayed until after the age where we reason as adults, most people, by far, stay in the religion of their birth. And so my question really is simple, and I asked it actually previously, in effect. With all the arguments that we've seen, other religions, or religions other than Christianity, have holy books. They claim miracles. They claim personal transformations in their lives. There are Muslim drug rehabilitation centers where former addicts say, I couldn't have done it without Allah. So how do you differentiate between their beliefs and yours?
Okay, so when we talk about religion, a lot of people will say you believe what you believe, and it's true because I believe it, because I experience it. And my understanding of religion is that if the claims that religion makes are true, they're making claims about the world as it really is. And so it needs to match up with the world that you're in. If you grew up in a culture that said the earth is square, and another one said that the earth is an oblong, and the other one said that the earth was round, you couldn't say, well, just because my mom taught me, that's true, and so we must all just agree with it because it's, that's how we learnt it. The question comes down to, is it actually true? And the interesting thing is you've grown up in a Christian culture, but you've said, no, it's not true. So you're able to assess that decision. For me, the question comes down to, specifically honing in on this thing, is how do you choose a religion? And broadly, I would say you break religions into atheism, pantheism, which says God is everything, or theism, which says that God is separate from the universe. And this thing that's had the huge impact on me is this cosmological argument that says that the universe, there was a point when there wasn't a universe, when there was no matter, when there was no energy, when there was no time, there was nothing. And whatever created this universe or brought it into existence isn't part of that system. So pantheism can't make sense. And I think for me that was like a death shot for atheism. Because where did it come from? There is something beyond the time-space matter that we move in. So what religions fit into that system? Which religions say that God is separate from his creation? Or the big three, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And that's actually why I looked at Islam as how are these guys making the claims? What's it based on? What's the authenticity of the Koran? Who's Muhammad? What life is he living? How does it work? why do I, this authenticity of the Christian scriptures, like I'm going to put my life in this guy's hands, it better be true. And the resurrection again, it's like I'm like a broken record. And as a result of testing those things, I became a Christian. And Christianity is one of the few religions that says, test me. If the resurrection is not true, move on and pick another religion. So if you wanted to exclude a lot of them, I would say start with Christianity. And then my little punt, in the back there on the right-hand side on the table, there's a whole lot of books about a Christian lawyer that actually went through this process. You can take a book for free and you can take 5 for your friends. And he became a Christian because of this argument for the resurrection. So it's easy for me, well, relatively easy. God separate from the universe. You got 3 religions, Christianity, the resurrection.
Okay, so a brief rebuttal there would be that, and again, this is an entirely separate debate as well, and potentially a whole evening, but the whole premise of your initial position there was what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever
comes into being.
Whatever starts to exist has a cause. The universe started to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And I'll grant the validity of the Kalam because, for the sake of conversation here, but I don't accept its premises necessarily at all. But that could take us down a rabbit hole for another hour. But even if we accept the Kalam, why does the cause necessarily have to be the Christian God? Because there are multiple causes. Why do you jump to a God? Why any God at all? There are causes. I mean, who was it? Any sufficiently developed technology is indistinguishable from magic. There are many possible causes. How have you eliminated those, and why do you leap to a God? And how do you know necessarily that this cause has to be outside of time and space and matter? These are assertions, but I haven't seen justification for them.
My argument would be that even the aliens would have to be in the universe. So if you run the universe back, time and space and matter and everything that we know, and it comes together to a point and it becomes less. If you think it becomes a singularity, and then there's nothing, like and nothing. I mean, we can't really conceptualize that. So no time, no matter, no space, incredibly powerful. And you're going, well, that's what we conceptually understand as God. Next question.
Okay.
God and God changing his commands.
Yes. So God is presumably unchanging. His morality is therefore also unchanging. God is absolute, and his morality therefore presumably is absolute. So my question is, why are some things a sin in the Old Testament that aren't in the New? And why today do we regard things as morally repugnant that God not only condoned, but in fact commanded in the Old Testament?
Okay, so quickly, the first thing is, it's obvious, but this doesn't speak about God's existence. So you might not like the God, but not saying anything about whether he exists or not. And the second point is, if there is no God, then as Roos has said, your arguments about morality are just your opinion. It has no basis. Today, you like this thing, tomorrow you like that thing. So from an atheist position, there is no actually much of an argument. It is a question for Christians. I mean, we're making the claim about God's unchanging nature. And what I would say is that the command must be differentiated from the value or the principle that underpins it. So I tell my kids, don't run out into the street, hold my hand when you walk across the street, because I want to protect his life and I want him to develop. When he's 18, I said, get out of my house, get into the street, go find a job. because my principle is that I want to teach him that he needs to live his life. So specifically the Old Testament, and I think the angry bad God hypothesis, that particularly is directed at the Jewish people, where God is dealing with them in a specific time, at a specific place, in a specific way. And one of the advantages of fighting or having these discussions on the Christians' territory is that we've looked at this a lot, and God reveals himself progressively through the New Testament. We call it progressive revelation. So the way that he's dealt with the Israelites at that time and that space is different from how he's done it, but the underlying principles and the underlying values remain the same. Thank you.
So, quick response there. I would have to call you out slightly on the idea that it doesn't talk to the existence of God, because we're not just talking about the existence of a God here. You're presenting the existence of a Christian God. And the Christian God is claimed to be omnibenevolent. He's specifically a good God who loves us and wants to save us. And so his inconsistency with goodness precisely does talk to his existence in terms of the God that Christians actually claim is there. The morality argument is a massive one, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole either, but I want to point out here that there's a difference between objective morality, and Reitze used the word objective, and absolute morality. And from where I sit, when you're talking about a God who is telling us what is real and what is right and wrong, we're not talking about objective morality, we're talking about absolute morality. And if something is simply right because God says it, that is the definition of subjectivity. When a single being is saying, this is right and this is wrong, that's not objective, that's subjective. As far as the atheist position goes, and we don't, but we simply base it on well-being. The only arbitrary step that I have to make as an atheist is to care about the well-being of you folks and other living creatures, other sentient creatures. That's the only arbitrary step I have to make. Based on that standard, I can then make objective assessments about the morality of a specific action based on its effects on you or on other living creatures.
And then your last question was about the
yes.
Egypt.
So my last question was, it's based on the story of the Exodus. And the Bible tells us that God commanded Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, and Pharaoh refused. And in other places, God, in fact, hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then God says to Moses, one fine day, tonight go and collect riches from all the Egyptians, because I'm gonna make them favorably disposed towards you. And during the course of the night, I'm going to kill every Egyptian firstborn. And not only the Egyptian firstborn, but also the firstborn of all the slaves of the Egyptians. And not only the firstborn of the slaves of the Egyptians, but also the firstborn of the animals of the Egyptians. And so my question is, how is that moral? How were the children of the slaves? How were the children of the Egyptians themselves? How were the animals responsible for the actions of Pharaoh, whose heart, in fact, was hardened by God himself? That's the question.
So I think when you're telling that story, you're obviously pulling out a component of it. And again, because we study this and I have those questions myself. The first point that I would say is shouldn't be thinking of God as some superhuman with, like a man plus infinite knowledge, a man plus this, as though God stands there as some super being saying, well, this. God, as we understand it, is the very creator of of our existence, of the universe, sustainer of it, granter of life itself. And the whole basis of this argument is that somehow God woke up one morning and decided, okay, let's just do this. If you look at the background of this, is that God 400 years before this says that the Egyptians are going to do this, that this is going to happen, that the Egyptians for 400 years have been treating the Israelites as slaves. At the time when Moses is born, they start to kill every single male child of the Israelites. And they never seem to rescind that. So for 40 years, they're killing every single male. They take the girls away. They subjugate the Israelites, use them as slave labor. Now, in every debate that I've had with an atheist, they're always saying, why doesn't God stop evil? You know? But when it seems to stop evil, then they don't like it. So, and he says that, and God doesn't just cruise in there and kill all of the guys, you know. That's actually the 10th plague or the 10th warning. The first time he comes, he says, let my people go. And he says to him, otherwise there's going to be a problem. And Pharaoh says no. And then he brings on gnats. Now gnats are irritating, but they're not, you know, disgusting. And then the next plague comes, and the next plague. And every time Pharaoh goes, he hardens his heart. Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh hardens his heart. And in the passage in Samuel, it actually says that both Pharaoh and the people of Israel hardened, the people of Egypt, not just Pharaoh, the people as an entity hardened their hearts against what was happening. And there are some people that respond to the warnings that God gives. And so it continues, and so it continues, and so it continues, to the point where God brings a judgment. And he's not standing there, you know, capriciously. He's standing in judgment both over the Jews and over this nation and over all the nations. We don't like that concept of God as a judge where he calls people to account for that. So God is not doing this stuff arbitrarily. He's actually writing, and he's patient, and he's giving the guys warning, and he gives the Egyptians warnings. He actually tells them how to avoid the plague. So the concept of, that putting it all together, when God actually intervenes, people are unhappy about it. Then if God is the creator and the sustainer of life, God cannot commit murder. Again, you sort of put it as though God comes out and he commits a murder. If he is the sustainer and the creator and the giver of life, he can take life. He doesn't murder. And in fact, then when you die, you don't die, you actually just change positions. We believe that there's an afterlife. So you move from one condition of existence into a second condition of existence. And God takes all of our lives. Unless you've got a special elixir, when you hit 82 or 85 or 90 or 5 or 2, God will take your life. That's what happens. But there is something beyond that, which is the claim of Christianity, is that there is more than just this life. And then finally, you know, I've been in some of these debates before, and in a discussion I had with somebody, I said to the girl, are you pro-abortion or are you pro-life? And she said, no, she's, you know, pro-abortion. I say, well, it's interesting that when you take the life of a young child or an unborn child, we call it a moral right. But when God takes the life of that which he's created, people are saying, no, this is morally reprehensible. So I think the thing is, actually, when you come down to it, people are unhappy about God acting in this capacity as God, as an, you know, that there's somebody in judgment over us. Finally, God sends a man called Jonah, which you guys know from the whale, but actually that's not the point of the story, to a city called Nineveh. And he sends one man to this and says, you guys must repent or I'm going to destroy the city. And the city repents. And God doesn't destroy the city. And Jonah moans at God. And he says to him, you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. And that is the character of God, that is the nature of God, both as judge, but one that grants you an opportunity to turn around and to say, turn away from it. And that is the Christian message. That we are lost, that there's a problem, that you can't do it by yourself, and that was my own experience, but that in Jesus Christ there is an opportunity to sidestep this. How about that little preaching in the middle there, you see that?
So, I'll do a final rebuttal and then...
Yeah.
I think your opening there, for me, was kind of a support of my argument, that in fact, God simply doesn't provide the moral objectivity that is claimed here. Apparently God can't commit murder, folks. I don't see, that's simply an assertion. It's simply an a priori, just a direct assertion that whatever God says and whatever God does, by virtue of his status as God, is automatically right, even though it's palpably immoral. The answer to the question, for me, wasn't an answer. It never answered why these children and these slaves' children, and these animals, calves and cubs and whatever else, were responsible for the actions of Pharaoh. And it didn't answer the question of when Pharaoh's heart was in fact hardened by God as well. In terms of the abortion question, I think we need to be careful about equivalence. I'm not pro-abortion. That would be a straw man. I am pro-choice. What that means is that women get to choose. And the choices they make are not with respect to children who have been born. In the overwhelming majority of cases, those choices are made in early term with respect to fetuses that don't yet have fully formed bodies, may not feel pain, don't have sensations. And as a very simple illustration to you of the fact that there's no equivalence here, I would simply ask, if you were in a clinic and there was a fire and there was a 3-month-old baby in one room and 1,000 fertilized embryos in test tubes in another, which would you save? And if it's the baby, then you understand the difference in value of a fully formed human being as compared to an embryo.
Okay, thanks guys. I know we can go on the whole evening. I suspect some don't want us to go on the whole evening. I've had 30, 40 pieces of paper. And you'll be happy to know that I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them have, in my mind, kind of been answered, and I don't want to go there. Please forgive me for the choices I've made. I'm not for bias, but not for choosing yours. You know what I'm saying? And I'm trying to wrap it up as well. All right. Both these gentlemen, I'm sure, would be very happy for you to send them an email. Charles has already given his email address, and I'm sure Reitze will be happy to as well. So if it's burning, please ask them. All right, I'm not trying to avoid questions here, I'm trying to wrap it up. So, Reitze, if you still have doubts, 1 minute answers.
Yeah.
If you still have doubts, what are they?
I don't understand all components of suffering. I'm not called for tonight. Somebody's coming for me. One gentleman died like 2 hours ago, and with his family. And I sometimes look at it and go, I don't understand that. And those things bother me. I think that Christianity provides a really good answer, better than any other one, but it's not a complete answer. I don't understand all of that. I think that's probably sort of as an existential thing. And then, I mean, some of this, when you really get into some of the technical stuff, in some of the philosophy, I'm like, whoa, I don't see how. I got asked a question last week, and I said, I don't even understand the question. Seriously, I didn't. And sometimes those things will go like, well, okay, I don't really understand that, but let's get stuck into it and see if it makes sense. And those things bring up doubt with me.
Yeah, good, thank you. I'm going to modify this question a little bit for both of you. What do you, Charles? It was a question to Charles. I'm going to ask you first. How do you bring up your children? Do you tell them there is no God, or do you tell them go find out if there is a God? Because I think Reitze will say that he brings up his children saying there is a God. Am I right?
Yeah, but I want to qualify that.
Yeah. Okay.
So the question is based on a false premise, and I'm going to deal with that. I tell my children, firstly, interestingly, I left Christianity, and I had raised my children as Christians up to that point. So I was at risk of losing my wife and family at that stage. I haven't lost them. I love them, and they love me, and we're together, and we're happy. I tell my children that whatever they believe, I will love them unconditionally, no matter what. They can be gay. They can marry people of other races. They can. I will love them till the day I die or they die, and I hope that I go first. In terms of saying there is no God, this is a jar of marshmallows. Okay? my contention, my position as an atheist, and this may surprise you, is not that there is no God. My position is that the claims for God are unconvincing to me. And the simple illustration is, if I tell you, Al, and we haven't counted them, there's an even number of marshmallows in this jar. And you say to me, I don't believe you, Charles. Are you claiming that there's an odd number? No. You're claiming or responding that we don't have sufficient evidence to accept the claim that there's an even number. In other words, saying I don't believe that there is a God is different to saying I believe there is no God. So no, I wouldn't tell my children there is no God. I would tell them that I find the claims insufficient, and I would tell them, like anybody should, that they should go and evaluate the claims and not accept any claim about anything, especially in the important stuff, until there's sufficient evidence.
Thank you.
I want to say something. If you can get Charles to believe that there's a God, you get the marshmallows.
More like a Nobel Prize.
Stranger things have occurred. Okay. When things occur that are unexplainable, do you count them as miracles? I think the answer is no. How do you explain things that are unexplainable? I'm rewording, but how do you explain?
That's fine. So there are many inexplicable things in the world. And as I alluded to at the start of my main presentation, we have, and this is what I think Reitze was getting at. I don't believe in this God-shaped hole. I don't believe that we're wired to be religious. I think the wiring is probably more to do with a quest for answers, a yearning for answers. And when humanity was in its infancy, we ascribed diseases and famine and other misfortune to gods of volcanoes and gods of lightning and thunder. And diseases we ascribed also to demons and monsters and witches. Now, the fact that we have this desire makes us very tempted to fill the hole, the knowledge hole, with something. For me, the answer that I don't know is sufficient. And until we have better tools to know, I'd rather simply say, this is what I do know. This is what reasonably constitutes knowledge to an extent where knowledge actually means something. And this is what I don't know. And I hate not knowing things, but I hate thinking things that are wrong even more.
Can I add on to that? To a large degree, I agree with Charles. Like, just because something interesting happens, everybody's running around pointing and saying, oh, that's God, oh, that's God, oh, that's God. And in the end, I think it becomes almost meaningless. I want to pull the distinction and say that that's hopefully what I've not done today. I've said that when I look at these evidences, there's an induction. It says, when I put this seems to point to this seems to point to that. And I'm not saying I come to this conclusion because I don't know. I'm saying because I know this, I'm coming to this conclusion. And I think the God of the gaps also works the other way. You can have the God of the science gaps or the science gaps. We don't know yet, but science will provide the answer. We don't know yet, but science will provide the answer. Science becomes a great panacea. It's Dawkins' thing. We don't know yet, but we're working on it. So you don't deal with the issue, you just delay it.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to make this the final question. To Reitze, assuming your reasoning that God exists relies on evidence you provided, and there's a whole list, is it necessary to deify and worship this creationist impulse? Does this magnificent force care? Why should it? Are we not imposing our own inadequacies on this force? 1 minute, please.
Right, yeah, no worries. Okay, so the question is then, can I know what this entity is? Uncreated, timeless, spaceless, separate from the universe. And I'm going to argue agent, there's personal, because it can choose to act, can choose to create. Because if there is no matter, then what else is there but choice? There's mind. There's something that can create. So then the question goes, well, out of all of this, you can have a God that created and set the world on a clockwork, and off he went, and you're never there again. He's floating around and creating other galaxies and other worlds. And then it comes down to this, say it with me, the resurrection thing. Because the claims that Jesus Christ makes, he's saying, I am the Son of God. They kill him because he's making these claims of the Son of God. He's crazy. He dies. He says, I'm going to rise. He rises from the dead. He proves it. So then I look and say, well, he's proven that he's risen. What did he say? He makes all these claims. He puts all this stuff. He creates this entity. He explains who God is. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So I don't know. I never would have known what God was. I would have, you could postulate anything, but I've anchored it around this event. And it validates the statements that Jesus Christ made about who God is and his character and his nature. And that's why it's called Christianity. It's not just a statement, it's the follower of Christ. And it's the statements that Christ made. So my evidence works. I can follow this to the point where I rely on Jesus and I believe him to be trustworthy. And therefore, I rationally can accept what he says. It's like I'm an anaesthetist. Propofol is a dangerous drug. Now, you only believe that because you know me, and I'm an anaesthetist. You don't have a clue what propofol is, and if you do, come and talk to me. But all of the stuff about the nature of God, I'm under a minute, come on. All of the stuff about the nature of God is linked to what Jesus Christ tells us, and that's where that evidence thing lies.
Okay. That's how they bill you in theatre as well. 1 minute, 1 minute, exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your attendance. I hope you found it stimulating, thought-provoking, entertaining. Thanks, Reitze. For your church. I'd like to thank the speakers. They've obviously put a lot of effort into their preparation. They're passionate about their subject, so can we give them another hand of applause? While I'm on the thank you to the school, and please remember to if there's rubbish, take it with you. Look after the school. Don't do donuts in the field. Thank you to the ladies and gents who packed out and prepared coffee. I'm sorry it ran out. We honestly didn't expect so many people. Lastly, if your interest has been piqued, I beg of you not to just rub it away and to forget it, to just forget it. So we've given 3 options here in the back of this piece of paper. The first one is a KEGS apologetics group. If what you heard tonight piqued your interest, stimulated you, if you're interested in this, the KEG group is going to follow on from this. It's a group I will lead as a strong word, that I will gather together, and we're going to discuss the authenticity of the Bible, the reasons for God, as have been discussed tonight. We meet in the keg, obviously, we have a beer, and we probably will use Paul Little's book, Know Why You Believe, as a guide or a starting point for discussion. First option. Second option, if you believe in God and you'd like to know more about Jesus, there's a course called Discover Jesus. It's a 4-week course, and Monday's going to lead that. Just tick in here, fill in your details, leave it somewhere, give it to me, please, all right, and come on the course. Lastly, if you would like to join the Midland Skeptics group, they're called the Cosmic Teapots. There's a reason for that, all right? There's a good reason for that, and Charles will explain it. Please tick that box, all right? And Charles will get hold of you, all right? His number was on the screen. We can put it back on, and his email address, and you can contact him as well. Ladies and gentlemen, lastly, thank you for your attendance and for the evening.